Ho 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 everyone, I'm Nökwi.
And ho ho ho, I'm Peter.
And
we
are
the
Birds
of
Play!
So, in this video, we're going to be getting into the true spirit of the holidays. No, not by helping others or by doing some sort of charity work, but rather by making a list of things that we personally want in our lives. Also, since this is a Final Fantasy channel, our wishlist will of course be Final Fantasy related, meaning that we will be leaving wishing for peace on earth and goodwill to all men to you good folks at home. Instead, we will be focusing on something just as important as world peace, namely what we would like to see in the upcoming and highly anticipated Final Fantasy XVI.
In this video, we're going to be talking about our hopes and dreams for the story, the game world, and of course the gameplay. But speaking of hopes and dreams, if you end up liking the video, or if you just like Final Fantasy in general and would like to add a Final Fantasy channel to your list, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us for another year of Final Fantasy. But for now, let's make it snow. Oh, what should the story be like? Something new or just like riding a bike? Oh, what should the story be like?
So far there have been two major sources of information about Final Fantasy XVI. The first one is the trailer that was revealed at the PlayStation Showcase back in September, and the second is the official website, which was launched at the end of last October, with Naoki Yoshida claiming that the next big reveal wasn't scheduled until next year.
Yes, and with 2020 coming to a close, it's not really hard to believe that we shouldn't expect any further updates in the next few days. But it is of course curious to see when in 2021 we will actually be getting the next big information reveal. But as someone that has now analyzed both the English and the Japanese version of both the trailer and website, what are some of your hopes for the story?
Well, first of all, I think Final Fantasy XVI needs to really take the criticism that was thrown at Final Fantasy XV to heart. So first and foremost, the story needs to be self-contained and not rely on stuff outside of the game to be coherent. As much as I may have enjoyed the movie Final Fantasy XV Kingsglaive, or the Final Fantasy XV anime series, or any of the other supplementary material, be it planned episodic DLC or the Japanese audio drama that was then transcribed into English, both the critical and the popular reception of the game really suffered on account of the story seemingly not being able to stand on its own 2 feet. And this isn't limited to the English-speaking world, since even in Japan, or at least in some Japanese game reviews, you can see the same line of criticism being issued, which is particularly interesting due to the fact that these sort of transmedia properties are much more common in Japan than in the West. So even though this sort of setup should have hypothetically been more palatable to a Japanese audience, ultimately the same concerns were raised about Final Fantasy XV as a somewhat flawed transmedia property.
Do you think there's any danger of Final Fantasy XVI story also being presented in such a fragmented way?
Well, at the moment there is a certain level of quality assurance associated with the name Naoki Yoshida. Yoshida having brought Final Fantasy XIV back from the brink of death and made it into one of the most acclaimed MMORPGs in the world. It's also somewhat reassuring that Yoshida seems to be aware of the criticism directed at 15 and is doing his best to subvert these expectations established by it, by choosing not to reveal the game with a sort of flashy pre-rendered trailer or cinematic, but rather choosing to use in-game cinematics in order to signal to players that the game isn't just a pretty cinematic and that it won't get stuck in the same developmental hell as Final Fantasy XV did.
So, what do I put on the list? Self-contained story?
That sounds good to me.
Anything else you would like to add about the actual story itself, maybe?
Well, after analyzing the trailer and the website, I can at least say that I think that the setting and the lore is very promising, with these different realms maintaining a delicate balance between each other, all the while being threatened by this external force, known as the Blight in English, or Kuro no Itai in Japanese, which corresponds to the name Kuroki no Ifrito, or the Black Ifrit, establishing some sort of connection between the Blight and the Dark Ifrit, as the Akon or Summon is known in the English version. With so many different parties vying for power, the story will almost undoubtedly at some point feature the theme of joining together or banding together in the face of a common enemy. But my wish for the story is that the enemy or the villain of the story will be a somewhat sympathetic villain or have a sympathetic goal. A sympathetic villain isn't a very common trope in Final Fantasy, and I can only really think of Vayne Solidor from Final Fantasy XII that fits this bill for me.
How about Kuja from Final Fantasy IX?
Kuja from Final Fantasy IX is very relatable, since his whole character arc revolves around his inability to cope with the prospect of death. It's however not as easy to be sympathetic to his actual end goal, since it's just destructive instead of being productive in some way. If you're listening and want to discuss sympathetic villains in the Final Fantasy series, please leave a comment down below about a villain you feel is sympathetic. Oh yeah, Caius from Final Fantasy XIII too is also somewhat sympathetic. But yeah, I'll talk with you down in the comments.
Nice. Get that engagement. Ride that YouTube algorithm. So, just to summarize for the wish list, you want a villain that you can root for or feel conflicted about fighting. A sympathetic villain.
Yeah, that would be one of my wishes. Aside from that, there are of course a lot of speculations we could make about the story, but since this isn't that kind of video, I think we'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, I'll put a little bonus wish here at the bottom about wishing that we won't have to wait too long for the game to come out, since Naoki Yoshida has given us reason to hope.
Yeah, I'll second that wish, but I think next we were going to be talking about the game world.
What's there to do? What will be new? Walking in a brand new game world.
So, what are some of your hopes for the game world?
Well, for starters, I would just like to agree that I think Final Fantasy XVI needs to be mindful of some of Final Fantasy XV's failings. So just like you say that the story needs to be self-contained, I think we need all the important locations to be a part of the actual game. I'd be very disappointed if some major locations weren't actually in the game, like in the case of Final Fantasy XV's Insomnia or Niflheim. Imagine playing Final Fantasy VII and Midgar wasn't actually in the game.
Yeah, that was one of my biggest problems with Final Fantasy XV as well. So, visitable cities and towns. But what do you want these locations to be like?
Well, the trailer might give us the impression that Final Fantasy XVI takes place in a fairly bland medieval setting. Or maybe not bland, but at least not very novel. It doesn't feel like anything new, especially since the overall aesthetic is so reminiscent of The Witcher and Game of Thrones. Not that there's anything wrong with that per se, but innovative game worlds have been a staple of the Final Fantasy series for a long time. Thankfully, the website shows us that there are some very interesting places in the world of Final Fantasy XVI, even though we haven't still seen all of them. Only getting a picture of the capital of Sanbreque and the Crystalline Dominion, as well as having seen some of Rosaria in the trailer. My hope is that all of these places, as well as those we haven't seen, will look and feel significantly different from one another. We already know that they differ quite a bit culturally, but that also needs to be conveyed by the design itself. So even if there are just 6 notable cultures on the map, which actually is quite a lot, they can give the impression of the world being a lot larger than it actually is. Because you feel like you're not only crossing physical boundaries, but also cultural ones.
So, variety. There's probably a less general way to phrase that, but it will have to do for now. But now for the ultimate question. Are you hoping for an open world, or a more linear game world?
Personally, I wouldn't mind a linear game world that would take me on a beautifully crafted tour of all it has to offer, and wouldn't overstay its welcome. But I'm also totally fine with a more open world approach, and since it's hard to imagine the game not being open world, I think that's the basket I'll be putting all my eggs in.
That's not a very Christmassy metaphor, brother.
Okay, then that's the shoe I'll be putting my presents in.
So, just for clarification, Icelandic children put their shoes in the window on Christmas to get presents from the 13 Santa Clauses.
Or you lads.
What are some of your special holiday traditions? Leave a comment down below.
Praise be to the YouTube algorithm.
But okay, now the open world is in the shoe. What should the open world be like?
Well, I can't imagine Clive driving a car, so I'm guessing we'll be riding a chocobo a lot. And probably not just any chocobo, since we get a glimpse of Clive's mighty steed in the trailer. Whatever the major mode of transportation will be, I just hope that it will make journeying across the world enjoyable in itself. I did enjoy cruising around in Final Fantasy XV with the guys, even though it was mostly an automatic process. But I'm not sure I would want that kind of travel again in Final Fantasy XVI. Also because I imagine riding along in a caravan would be a lot slower process. Also, I hope the chocobo has a built-in radio. It's good shit.
So, we have visitable cities and towns, variety, to give the impression of a larger world, and lastly, an enjoyable way to travel between all of these places.
That sounds like a good start, or a good basis for a game world to me.
Amazing.
Deck the halls with brand new gameplay. La 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 la.
Right, so any thoughts in particular on the gameplay?
Well, I think there are some pretty standard concerns when it comes to gameplay, just like there are some standard questions when it comes to the story and the game world. How about we do something a little bit different for the gameplay, to mix it up a bit? So, I have a wish that might not be everyone's cup of tea. I for one would like to see the return of the junction system from Final Fantasy VIII.
What?
Or maybe more accurately the birth of the junction system 2.0. In the trailer we see Clive use powers from different Acons or summons, relying on their power in a similar way to the characters from Final Fantasy VIII, so it would be kind of cool to see the system make a comeback in one form or another. It also ties into more general concerns I have about how Final Fantasy XVI will build on the legacy of the Final Fantasy series as a whole.
Since we're at it, should we just bring Triple Triad back as well?
I would actually be all for it, and if there's anything Final Fantasy should take from The Witcher, it's the point that modern games can still include engaging card minigames.
Have you actually played Gwent?
Well, only for about a minute or so, but it seems to be fairly popular, even warranting its own spin-off title. I have, however, played Triple Triad extensively, and I have been waiting for its return. I know it's in Final Fantasy XIV, but I'm still just busy trying to finish the game.
So we have a Junction System 2.0 and Triple Triad. So you're basically saying Final Fantasy XVI should be like Final Fantasy VIII.
Well, 8 plus 8 equals 16, but I would of course also be open to some other callbacks to other Final Fantasy games. What would you want to include from older Final Fantasy games to intertwine Final Fantasy XVI with the already established legacy of Final Fantasy?
So if we're just making wishes, I guess. I've always been partial to the Final Fantasy X sphere grid, actually.
Yes, bring the sphere grid back. There are of course a lot more things we could wish for, but I think we'll leave it at that for now. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to tell us some of your wishes down in the comments below.
The algorithm! Bird sounds.